Guys, I'm just going to kind of launch into the questions here regarding the two videos for this module. In regards to the first module, things that I noticed differently about the instructional practices, disregarding the obvious ones like the preparing of lunch and the cleaning the classrooms and whatnot, was really just how inclusive the whole entire thing seemed. From the demonstration in the video with all the poems being sort of written by the students. No names on the papers. They're all just given a number that only they know so that they can kind of anonymously discuss it with the rest of the class. Seemed kind of cool. That seemed like something that would sort of inspire the other students to, I guess, work harder or their best, knowing that the rest of the class is going to read it. And it just promoted inclusivity because everyone's work got to be shared. And I feel like that kind of brings the students out of their shell a little bit more. And then it provided an opportunity for the student whose poem they deemed the best, or whichever it was, towards the end of that lesson, an opportunity to be able to more publicly recognized, which was cool. The boys were really happy in the video. That seemed like something that he really enjoyed. Appointing a classroom leader, I thought was really neat. It's a good way to kind of provoke leadership and inspire that from a young age. The fact that they thank the teacher at the end of the lesson was probably what stood out to me the most. I can't remember a time where a teacher was ever thanked like that when I was going to school, when I was that age. It almost seemed a little less respectful. There seems to be a genuine sense of respect in the classroom, from all the students to one another, of course, with them, making sure everyone has enough food and cleaning up after one another. It just seems a lot more respectful. And then, of course, having the gall to actually thank the teacher is like the utmost level of respect. The fact they all wore hats. I felt like when I was in elementary school, wearing a hat was, you were told this was like this terrible thing if you wore a hat and you get in huge, serious trouble. So it seemed interesting to me that, by comparison, hats was just a normal thing. I know it's kind of a minor thing to point out, but I noticed it nonetheless. For the second video, I'm going to be honest. I could not even name 5 things that lady was talking about. It was very difficult for me. I noticed that a lot of the things in the video were labeled, and I kept expecting her to talk with her hands, kind of like we do a lot in America. And I was waiting for her to point to an item as she would talk about that item, and then me kind of use that visual cue to kind of connect what she was talking about and look for the word that matches what she's pointing to. That didn't seem to happen. And I was at a complete and total loss, which I think was kind of a really neat, empathetic activity to understand what it might be like to be in a classroom like that. Because I was lost. I'd like to think I'm usually pretty good at using context clues and visual cues, and I got nothing. I watched it twice, and I was just like, what the heck is going on? So that kind of opened my eyes there. And as far as the questions for that, now that I've admitted I couldn't write anything down, that is obviously what made it so difficult to understand was the lack of visual cue and me just not knowing a sliver of the language. There weren't even any words that I'd heard before at all that I could even try to make sense of. So the total disadvantage there was a huge part of that. And I guess for me personally, the lack of visual cue was kind of maybe that's just how I learn. Everyone learns differently. I'm a very visual learner. So the lack of any type of visual cue was sort of a big deal for me, and being lost entirely. For the second question on that lesson, in terms of how we can, let me see here, give me just a moment. What do teachers need to know about students who are learning English? Well, obviously, that we would need to know, of course, that they very well might not know any of it. So we have to be extra cautious in that regard. Especially in the case of this video, I know that if I had been at least a little bit privy to whatever language was being spoken there, it may have been a little easier for me. And I guess maybe for certain English educators, it can be kind of tempting to assume that your audience or your students know like at least X amount of English, and you may kind of unintentionally, subconsciously cut corners. So, but to be very aware that your students may not know at all, and so you've got to go that extra mile. As far as general practices that may be beneficial to those students, I think a visual cue would be awesome. in a sense like that, if you've got something you're going to be continuously teaching about in your lesson, what harm could there be in just going a little further to point to that item every time that you say it? Because at the very least, someone that doesn't understand the language is going to eventually pick up that when you say that word out of your mouth, you point to that thing. Clearly, those things must be related. I know that's a really small kind of minor point, but things like that, especially to a child, if they can pick up that you continuously point at that when you say that, that can go a long way. And obviously, that's not universally applicable to every lesson you're ever going to teach, but I think something that small could go a long way, at least for the visual learners. And I think I skipped over a question on the first part of the module here. Yeah, what would be the most challenging for these students academically when they enter into our school system? Well, something else that I did notice that I meant to comment on earlier. I'm horrible at doing these videos in order. When the students would line their shoes up and they'd be graded on how, I guess, straight and narrow they were, that combined with the respect for the teacher and whatnot, there seemed to be a certain level of austerity in the classroom, and a certain type of mannerism and really properness, for lack of a better word, that they instilled in those students. That's one thing I think would be totally lost and very jarring in an American school system. That is not as emphasized when teaching the American students. I would argue that things are probably just inherently more messy in an American school. Not that American schools are a mess, but by comparison, they would certainly be a lot more messy. I really think lunch could be kind of jarring. Students from that specific environment maybe not know how to react when they're told to go to this room over here to be served lunch by another person, which is like the stark opposite of what they were doing in their school. A lack of respect for the teachers as well might be kind of hard to adjust to, and that being the norm instead of the exception could be really hard to get used to. So I think just the different nature, the less organizational structure of our schools compared to those schools would be very jarring for those students, would make them feel uncomfortable, a little bit out of place. That on top of not being able to understand much of the words at all can just create a really limiting environment and a really uncomfortable environment. So that again is something that we should be really conscious of within our classrooms, and something we should strive to not do basically the opposite of what was going on in that second video, so that our English language learners feel a lot more stoked and not as lost about the messages here. So that's what I've got for those two videos. Really glad I watched them, especially the second one. Kind of disappointed in myself for how little I was able to pick up on, but hopefully when I'm in a classroom, I will not make my students feel that way.